Killer Next Door, the chilling case of Sam Johnson true crime story. The friendly neighbor. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maple Grove, life moved at a leisurely pace. Families lived in well-manicured homes, children played in the cul-de-sacs, and everyone knew everyone else. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors borrowed sugar without hesitation. But behind the charming facade of this idyllic neighborhood lurked a sinister presence, one that no one could have ever imagined. At the center of the community was Sam Johnson. He was a mild-mannered man in his early 30s, unassuming with his neatly trimmed beard and warm smile. Sam had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, quickly becoming a beloved figure. He was the type of neighbor who helped fix broken fences, lent tools without a second thought, and never missed a neighborhood barbecue. Sam lived alone, which wasn't entirely unusual for someone of his age. He kept to himself, but was always polite and engaged in small talk with the other residents. His house, a modest 2-story home with a garden in the back, was always well kept, and his lawn was meticulously mowed. To everyone in Maple Grove, Sam was a model citizen. But there was something about Sam that made his closest neighbor, Mrs. Turner, uneasy. Mrs. Turner was a widow in her 70s who had lived in Maple Grove for over 2 decades. She had seen neighbors come and go, but something about Sam just didn't sit right with her. It wasn't anything overt, just a feeling, a gut instinct she couldn't shake. Mrs. Turner often saw Sam standing in his front yard, staring into the distance. He wasn't doing anything particularly strange, just observing, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent shivers down her spine. Whenever she mentioned her concerns to others, they brushed it off as old age, making her paranoid. But Mrs. Turner knew better. The unease grew stronger one evening when Mrs. Turner noticed something unusual. It was around midnight, and the street was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets. She had gone to her kitchen to get a glass of water when she spotted Sam in his backyard. He was digging. At first, she thought it was just an innocent task. Perhaps he was gardening or setting up a new flower bed. But the longer she watched, the more disturbing it became. Sam wasn't just digging, he was burying something. The hole he dug was large and deep, far too big for a plant or anything else one might normally bury in a garden. Mrs. Turner's heart raced as she peeked through the blinds, careful not to be seen. Sam moved methodically, his movements almost robotic. He carefully placed a large, dark object into the hole and began covering it with dirt. It was too dark to see what the object was, but the way Sam moved sent a chill through her. Something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Mrs. Turner debated whether to call the police. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, and the thought of accusing Sam of something nefarious made her stomach turn. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a misunderstanding? But as the day went on, her anxiety grew. She couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut, the gnawing suspicion that something dreadful had happened. That night, she stayed up late, her eyes glued to Sam's house, waiting for any sign of unusual activity. Her patience was rewarded when, at around 2 a.m., she saw Sam leave his house with a large trash bag slung over his shoulder. He moved quickly, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. Mrs. Turner's breath caught in her throat as she watched him load the bag into the trunk of his car. She strained her eyes, trying to make out the contents, but it was impossible to tell what was inside. Sam drove off into the night, and Mrs. Turner was left with a sinking feeling that something unspeakable had occurred. The next morning, she made up her mind. She would visit the police station. Even if they didn't take her seriously, she had to try. There was no way she could live with herself if something truly terrible had happened, and she had done nothing. As she put on her coat, ready to head out the door, she caught a glimpse of Sam through her window. He was standing in his front yard, staring directly at her house. His expression was unreadable, but there was something menacing in his gaze. It was as if he knew she had been watching him. Mrs. Turner's heart skipped a beat. Had she been discovered? A disturbing revelation. Mrs. Turner hesitated by the window, the weight of Sam's stare unsettling her deeply. She quickly pulled back from the glass, her heart racing in her chest. She had always trusted her instincts, but this time, she feared they had led her into something far more dangerous than she ever anticipated. Sam's gaze had sent a clear message, he knew. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, contemplating her next move. The police station was just a few blocks away, and she could easily walk there, but the thought of leaving the house now filled her with dread. What if Sam was watching? What if he knew she was going to report him? Shaking off the fear, Mrs. Turner decided to call the police instead. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, the phone heavy in her grasp. She listened to the dial tone, each ring amplifying the pounding in her chest. When the voice on the other end answered, she swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Maple Grove Police Department. How can we assist you? The calm voice of the dispatcher offered a glimmer of relief, but Mrs. Turner could feel the unease creeping back in. Hello, she stammered. I need to report something strange. It's about my neighbor, Sam Johnson. I think he might be involved in something dangerous. The dispatcher's tone became more attentive. Can you tell me what you've observed, ma'am? Mrs. Turner hesitated. Her words felt jumbled in her mind, but she recounted what she had seen. The midnight digging, the large dark object, the suspicious trash bag, and Sam's unnerving behavior. As she spoke, the reality of the situation sank in deeper. She wasn't just reporting a strange incident. She was placing herself in the middle of something potentially terrifying. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, we're going to send someone over to check it out. Please stay inside and lock your doors. Is there anything else you've noticed about your neighbor? Mrs. Turner's mind raced. She hadn't wanted to come off as paranoid, but now that she was recounting the events, she realized just how bizarre Sam had seemed over the past few months. He had no regular visitors, kept odd hours, and there was always an air of secrecy surrounding him. No one in the neighborhood really knew much about his personal life. No, nothing else, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But please, hurry. We'll have an officer there shortly. Stay safe. Mrs. Turner hung up, her hands still shaking. She double-checked her locks, securing every window and door, but her mind was racing. Had she done the right thing? Was Sam really dangerous, or had she misjudged the entire situation? Hours passed, and the sun dipped below the horizon. The quiet of the neighborhood began to settle in, but the tension in Mrs. Turner's house was unbearable. She paced the floor, glancing out the window every few minutes, her eyes darting between Sam's house and the street. Where were the police? Why hadn't anyone shown up yet? Suddenly, a soft knock at the door broke the silence. Mrs. Turner froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't heard any police sirens or cars pulling up. Slowly, she approached the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. Who is it? She called out, her voice trembling. It's Officer Reynolds from Maple Grove PD, a man's voice responded. I'm here to follow up on your call. Relief washed over her as she unlatched the door and opened it just enough to peer out. A uniformed officer stood on her porch, clipboard in hand. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness to his demeanor that told her he wasn't taking her report lightly. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Turner said, opening the door wider. I've been watching him for days, and I'm sure something is wrong. The officer nodded. We're going to look into it. I'll need you to show me exactly where you saw your neighbor acting suspiciously. Mrs. Turner led Officer Reynolds to the window facing Sam's backyard. She pointed to the patch of freshly disturbed earth, now partially covered by fallen leaves. It was faint, but the outline of the large hole Sam had dug was still visible. I saw him bury something there last night, Mrs. Turner whispered, her voice tense with anxiety. And then he left with that bag. Officer Reynolds studied the spot for a moment, his brow furrowing. All right, ma'am. Stay inside while I go speak to Mr. Johnson. We'll get to the bottom of this. Mrs. Turner watched nervously as the officer stepped off her porch and made his way across the lawn toward Sam's house. The air felt thick with tension, the quiet street suddenly ominous. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for what would happen next. Officer Reynolds knocked on Sam's door, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Mrs. Turner held her breath, her eyes locked on Sam's front door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door slowly creaked open, and Sam stepped into view, his face expressionless. From her window, Mrs. Turner could barely make out their conversation. Sam's calm, measured tone carried across the lawn, but his words were too quiet to hear. Officer Reynolds asked him something, his posture still alert, but Sam seemed unfazed. They exchanged a few words before the officer nodded and turned to leave. Mrs. Turner's heart sank. Had they found nothing? Was Sam going to get away with whatever he was hiding? As Officer Reynolds walked back toward her house, Mrs. Turner hurried to the door to meet him, hoping for some sort of explanation. But the look on his face as he approached told her that something wasn't right. "Well?" she asked, her voice tense with anticipation. The officer shook his head slightly. "He claims he was doing some late-night gardening. Says he buried an old tree stump and that the trash bag was full of yard waste he took to the dump." Mrs. Turner's heart dropped. "That's it? You believe him?" "I'm not saying I do or don't, ma'am," Officer Reynolds replied. "But for now, there's no evidence of a crime. We'll keep an eye on things, but unless something else comes up, there's not much we can do." Mrs. Turner stared at him in disbelief. She knew something was wrong. Deep down, she could feel it. But now it seemed as if she was the only one who did. The officer's radio crackled to life, and he responded, turning toward his car. "Stay safe, ma'am. Call us if anything else happens." As he drove away, Mrs. Turner stood at her window, her eyes fixed on Sam's house. The unease that had gnawed at her for weeks now felt like a heavy weight in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the officer had just walked away from something much darker than he realized. Sam had gotten away with it for now. But Mrs. Turner knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Secrets beneath the surface. The night passed in agonizing silence. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows sent Mrs. Turner's nerves into overdrive. She couldn't sleep, her mind consumed by the terrifying possibilities of what Sam might have done and what lay buried beneath his backyard. The following morning, the neighborhood seemed to carry on as usual. The sun shone through the trees, children played in their yards, and neighbors greeted each other with casual smiles. It was as if the sinister undercurrent Mrs. Turner felt was invisible to everyone else. But she couldn't shake the haunting memory of Sam's cold stare or the fresh patch of disturbed earth in his backyard. Her morning routine was in shambles. She couldn't eat, couldn't read, and every small sound jolted her nerves. The sight of Sam mowing his lawn as if nothing had happened made her stomach turn. He looked so normal, so composed, and that made everything worse. How could someone who seemed so ordinary be capable of the things she feared? Mrs. Turner spent most of the day pacing the house, peeking through the curtains, waiting for any sign that Sam might slip up. But the day came and went without incident, and soon dusk began to fall. As the light faded, so did her hope of finding any immediate answers. But that night, something strange happened. It was well past midnight when Mrs. Turner awoke to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, straining her ears to listen. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Then she heard it again, a faint scraping sound coming from outside. She tiptoed to her bedroom window and cautiously peered through the curtains. Sam was in his backyard again. This time, there was no shovel. Instead, he was crouched low to the ground, fiddling with something she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The scraping sound continued, steady and rhythmic, as if he was opening something hidden beneath the earth. Mrs. Turner's pulse quickened. She reached for the binoculars she kept on her dresser, trying to get a better look. Through the lenses, she could just barely see the outline of what looked like a small, square trapdoor set into the ground. Sam was prying it open, his movements careful and precise. She gasped, pulling the binoculars away from her eyes for a moment, her mind reeling. A trapdoor? What on earth could Sam be hiding beneath his backyard? Her curiosity was piqued, but more than that, she felt a growing sense of dread. Whatever Sam was doing, it wasn't gardening. She watched in horrified fascination as Sam lifted the trapdoor and descended into the dark opening. He moved quickly, as though he had done this many times before. Seconds later, he disappeared completely from view, leaving only the faint glow of a flashlight in his wake. Mrs. Turner's heart raced. She knew she should call the police, But after the last encounter, she hesitated. They had already dismissed her concerns once. What if they did the same thing again? What if they thought she was just an old woman with too much time on her hands, making wild accusations? But this time, she was certain something was wrong. No one has a hidden trapdoor in their backyard for innocent reasons. Gathering her courage, Mrs. Turner grabbed her phone and snapped a few photos through the window. She needed evidence, something she could show the authorities to prove that Sam was hiding something far more sinister than tree stumps and yard waste. For what felt like an eternity, she waited. Minutes ticked by, and there was no sign of Sam returning from the underground lair. The stillness of the night seemed to close in on her, the weight of what she had witnessed pressing down like a lead blanket. She couldn't take her eyes off that gaping hole in the ground, wondering what secrets it held. Then, suddenly, Sam emerged from the trapdoor, his expression as calm and controlled as ever. He carefully shut the hatch behind him, making sure it was sealed tight before covering it with dirt and debris. As if nothing had ever been disturbed, Sam wiped his hands on his pants and headed back inside his house, without a single glance around him. Mrs. Turner's breath hitched as she watched him disappear into his home. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. What had he been doing down there? And more importantly, how long had this been going on? She couldn't wait any longer. Gathering her resolve, Mrs. Turner picked up the phone and dialed the police once again, praying they would listen this time. Digging for the truth. The police arrived quickly, much faster than before. 2 patrol cars pulled up quietly outside her house, their lights off to avoid drawing attention. Mrs. Turner greeted them at the door, her face pale with anxiety. "I told you something was wrong," she whispered, handing over the photos she had taken. "He has a hidden trapdoor in his backyard. I watched him go down there last night." The officers exchanged glances, their faces darkening as they examined the images. This wasn't something they could brush off. One officer nodded and turned to his partner. "We'll take a look. Stay inside, ma'am, and lock your doors." Mrs. Turner nodded, her hands trembling as she stepped back inside. She locked the door behind her and hurried to the window, watching as the officers made their way across the street to Sam's house. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The officers knocked on Sam's door, but there was no response. Mrs. Turner held her breath, wondering if Sam had somehow sensed what was happening and fled. But just as the officers turned to leave, the door creaked open. Sam stepped into view, his face calm, almost friendly, as he greeted the officers. From her vantage point, Mrs. Turner couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the tension in the officers' body language. One of them pointed toward the backyard, and Sam's expression briefly faltered. For the first time, Mrs. Turner saw something crack in Sam's composed exterior, a flash of anger, quickly masked by a placid smile. The officers weren't swayed. They gestured toward the backyard again, and Sam reluctantly led them around the side of the house. Mrs. Turner's heart raced as she watched them approach the spot where the trapdoor was buried. Her hands clenched the windowsill, knuckles white as she prayed they would find something that proved her suspicions. Minutes passed, and then, suddenly, the officers stopped. One of them crouched down, brushing away leaves and dirt to reveal the faint outline of the hatch. Mrs. Turner's pulse quickened as the officer signaled for his partner to call for backup. They had found it. But what was inside? What had Sam been hiding in that dark, hidden space beneath the ground? Mrs. Turner's stomach churned as she watched more officers arrive, their flashlights illuminating the backyard as they worked to pry open the hatch. Sam stood to the side, his expression unreadable, but Mrs. Turner could see the tension in his posture. He knew the game was up. The trapdoor finally creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel leading into the earth. One of the officers descended into the darkness, and Mrs. Turner held her breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then the officer emerged, his face grim. They had found something terrible. Mrs. Turner's heart sank as she watched Sam being handcuffed and led toward the patrol car. The other officers were still at the scene, digging deeper, their expressions tight with horror. Whatever lay beneath Sam's backyard had finally come to light, and it was far worse than anyone in Maple Grove could have imagined. As Sam was led away in handcuffs, Mrs. Turner stood frozen at her window, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare. The officers worked methodically, removing dirt and debris, their flashlights casting eerie shadows across Sam's backyard. The quiet tension in the air felt suffocating. Mrs. Turner couldn't see what they were pulling out, but the horrified expressions on their faces told her everything she needed to know. Something unspeakable had been hidden down there. The image of Sam's calm, friendly demeanor played in her mind, but now it felt grotesque, a mask covering something dark and monstrous. How could someone she had exchanged casual pleasantries with in passing be involved in something like this? Her stomach churned, and she had to turn away from the window, overwhelmed by nausea. She collapsed onto her couch, her heart still racing. It felt surreal, as if the walls of her home were closing in on her. This quiet, unsuspecting neighborhood had been harboring a monster, and she had been right next door the entire time. A knock on her door startled her. Jumping to her feet, she hurried to open it, finding Officer Reynolds standing there, his expression somber. "Mrs. Turner," he began, his voice low and serious. "I want to thank you for reporting what you saw. Without your call, we might never have found this." She swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "What did you find?" The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he considered his words. "It's bad, ma'am. We're still investigating the full extent, but we found remains, several, in fact. They were buried under that trapdoor. We'll need to conduct a full forensic examination, but it looks like this has been going on for quite some time." The words hit Mrs. Turner like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of her. "Remains?" she whispered, her mind struggling to process the horror. "You mean people?" Officer Reynolds nodded grimly. "We believe so. We'll know more soon, but there's no doubt that your neighbor, Sam Johnson, is responsible for some very disturbing things." Mrs. Turner's knees felt weak, and she gripped the doorframe to steady herself. All along, she had sensed something was off about Sam, but never in her worst nightmares had she imagined this. People, innocent people, had lost their lives, and it had happened right under her nose. She had been living next to a serial killer. The officer gave her a moment to collect herself before continuing. "We'll have investigators around for the next few days, combing through the evidence. It would be helpful if you could come down to the station at some point to give a formal statement, just so we have everything on record." Mrs. Turner nodded numbly. "Yes, of course. Anything to help." Officer Reynolds gave her a sympathetic look. "I know this is a lot to take in, but you did the right thing. You may have saved lives by speaking up." She barely registered his words as he left. She stood in the doorway, staring out into the night, her mind spinning with images of what might have been buried in that underground lair. For the first time in her life, she felt truly unsafe in her own home. The warm glow of her living room felt distant, and the familiarity of her surroundings seemed distorted, as if the world had shifted into something darker and more dangerous. Sam Johnson wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a monster, a predator who had hidden in plain sight. And she had been close enough to feel the danger, but not close enough to stop it. The next few days were a blur. The street was cordoned off with police tape, and investigators moved in and out of Sam's house like a swarm of bees, collecting evidence and mapping out the grim puzzle that had been Sam's life. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and soon the quiet Maple Grove neighborhood was overrun with reporters, their vans lining the street, cameras pointed at the House of Horrors. Mrs. Turner stayed inside, blinds drawn, avoiding the chaos outside. She watched the news coverage from her living room, the details of Sam's crimes slowly coming to light. According to police, the bodies found beneath the trapdoor had been buried at different times, some dating back several years. Sam had meticulously chosen his victims, targeting people who wouldn't be missed, drifters, transient workers, and those on the fringes of society. He had created an elaborate system of tunnels beneath his house, a hidden graveyard for his gruesome deeds. The community was in shock. No one could fathom how someone as seemingly ordinary as Sam Johnson could harbor such evil. Neighbors who had once waved at him in passing now spoke of their unease, how there had always been something off about him, but none had imagined anything so horrific. Mrs. Turner, however, knew she would never forget the chill that had run down her spine that night. The moment she saw him digging in his backyard, the moment she realized something was terribly wrong. She had been the first to see through Sam's mask, and now, in the wake of his arrest, the full weight of that knowledge bore down on her. The monster unmasked. The trial of Sam Johnson became a nationwide spectacle. His face was plastered across every news channel, his chilling smile sending shivers down the spines of viewers across the country. Details of his crimes emerged during the proceedings, details so horrifying that even the most seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the depth of his depravity. Mrs. Turner was called to testify. She took the stand with trembling hands, recounting the moments that had led to Sam's downfall, the nights she had watched him from her window, the strange, late-night activities, the final call to the police that had set everything in motion. Her testimony was crucial, the nail in the coffin that secured Sam's fate. Sitting in the courtroom, Mrs. Turner felt the eyes of the nation on her. She tried to remain composed, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of everything that had happened. Sam sat across the room, shackled to his chair, his face impassive as if none of it affected him. He didn't even look at her, but she could feel his presence like a dark cloud hanging over the room. The prosecutor painted a picture of a meticulous, cold-blooded killer who had lived two lives, one as a quiet, unassuming neighbor and the other as a sadistic predator who had spent years taking lives in secret. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensics had matched DNA from the bodies to missing persons across multiple states, and Sam's journals, discovered in a hidden compartment in his house, detailed his methods, his twisted fantasies, and the way he had eluded capture for so long. But despite the mountain of evidence, Sam never spoke a word in his own defense. He never admitted guilt, nor did he show remorse. His silence only deepened the horror of what he had done, leaving everyone to wonder what else he had hidden away in the dark corners of his mind. The jury took only hours to deliberate. When they returned with the verdict, there was no surprise in the room. Sam Johnson was found guilty on all counts: multiple murders, kidnapping, unlawful disposal of human remains, and more. The judge's sentence was swift and final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, sealing Sam's fate, Mrs. Turner felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The monster next door was finally behind bars, where he could never harm another soul. But the nightmares remained. Even with Sam Johnson behind bars, Maple Grove would never be the same. The headlines slowly faded from the news, but the trauma lingered in the neighborhood like a stain that couldn't be washed away. The once quiet suburban streets now carried an undercurrent of dread, a reminder that the evil lurking in the world could be hiding behind any face, even one you thought you knew. For Mrs. Turner, life didn't simply return to normal. Though she no longer feared seeing Sam's shadow through her blinds, she couldn't shake the sense of guilt that gnawed at her. Every sleepless night was filled with what-ifs. What if she had reported the strange behavior sooner? What if she had pushed harder to investigate when her instincts told her something was off? Could she have saved someone? The questions haunted her, consuming her thoughts whenever she was alone. And then there were the letters. About a month after the trial ended, Mrs. Turner received the first one. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, with her name and address typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message that sent ice through her veins. "You were right to watch, but you missed so much." Her hands shook as she read it over and over, disbelief and terror swirling inside her. She knew the handwriting was unfamiliar, but the tone, the chilling taunt, it felt like Sam's shadow reaching out from prison, a ghost of his malevolence still lingering even after his conviction. At first, she tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank. The media attention had put her in the public eye, and it wasn't impossible that someone might try to exploit her vulnerability. Still, the words burrowed into her mind, feeding her anxiety. She found herself checking the locks on her doors multiple times a night, constantly peeking out her window for signs of anyone watching her. But then the second letter came. This one was more specific. "He wasn't the only one. You didn't stop anything." It was unsigned, just like the first. Mrs. Turner stared at it, her heart racing. It wasn't just a taunt anymore. It was a threat. The words seemed to suggest that Sam hadn't acted alone, or worse, that there were others like him still out there, watching, waiting. Terrified, She took the letters to Officer Reynolds, hoping for answers. He listened intently, his brow furrowing as he studied the notes. "It could be a copycat," he said, trying to reassure her. "We'll look into it. It might just be someone messing with you because of the trial." But his words didn't ease her fear. The letters felt too personal, too calculated to be the work of a random prankster. Someone was out there, someone who knew too much about her and about Sam's crimes. Days passed without incident, but the tension in Mrs. Turner's life never fully lifted. She withdrew from the world, rarely leaving her house except for essentials. The friendly neighbors who had once exchanged small talk with her now gave her concerned glances, whispering when they thought she wasn't looking. She had become the woman who lived next to a serial killer, the woman who had uncovered the truth but had paid the price with her peace of mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across her living room, she heard a knock at the door. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the sudden sound jolted her out of her daze. Peering through the peephole, she saw Officer Reynolds standing on her porch, his expression unreadable. She opened the door, relief washing over her for a moment. "Officer, is there any news? Have you found out who's been sending those letters?" He stepped inside, his demeanor unusually serious. "We've been investigating, Mrs. Turner, and we found something concerning." Her stomach dropped. "What is it?" "We traced the origin of the letters to a local post office, but that's not the part that worries me," he said, lowering his voice. "We've received reports, more than one, of missing people in the area, and they all disappeared recently, after Sam was already in custody." Mrs. Turner's blood ran cold. "You mean someone else is out there?" Reynolds nodded, his expression grim. "It looks that way. We don't know if they're connected to Sam, but there are similarities. And whoever it is, they're getting bolder." The room seemed to spin as Mrs. Turner tried to process the news. Sam's arrest had felt like the end of a nightmare, but now it seemed that the darkness wasn't confined to him alone. There was another killer, or killers, still lurking in the shadows. Reynolds placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. "We'll be increasing patrols in the area. If you see or hear anything suspicious, you need to let us know immediately. And I mean anything." She nodded, but the words barely registered. The sense of safety she had started to rebuild after Sam's arrest shattered in an instant. Someone was still watching her, still tormenting her with the knowledge that her role in uncovering Sam's crimes wasn't enough to stop the evil in the world. The fear crept back into her home, curling into every corner, leaving her feeling more alone than ever. That night, Mrs. Turner sat in her darkened living room, staring at the faint outline of Sam's house next door. It was quiet, almost peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was a lie. The letters had stopped for now, but the weight of their message still hung over her. She thought of the second letter again, its cryptic warning echoing in her mind. He wasn't the only one. Her fingers traced the edges of the letter as she whispered into the empty room. "Who else?" The silence gave no answer, but she couldn't help but feel the presence of eyes watching her in the dark. And she wondered, was it someone she knew? Or was the real killer still out there, hiding in plain sight, just like Sam had been? The nightmares had returned, but this time, Mrs. Turner knew they weren't just in her head.